Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today entitled Impactful Storytelling for Effective Entrepreneurship-Led Economic Development. My name is Rob Williams. I will be serving as today's moderator. I am director of SourceLink. So as a little bit of background, this webinar is actually being produced as part of Global Entrepreneurship Week, which is a week-long celebration SourceLink has participated in since its start nearly 16 years ago. In Jonathan Ortman's opening remarks, he talks a lot about how GEW is meant and designed to bring us all together as neighbors, as international friends, as partners, in a singular passion to champion entrepreneurs and small business owners. And it is in that celebration where our SourceLink team today has brought together really, truly an all-star panel to share lessons learned, best practices, top guidance that we hope you will be able to use in your own communities to improve how you are doing your storytelling and be more impactful in your entrepreneurship-led economic development efforts. So let's talk a little bit about that, right? Collecting entrepreneurship data and measuring the results of supporting businesses is an absolutely critical aspect when it comes to economic development. But equally important is how practitioners go about sharing the impact of their work through the data that's collected. So today we're going to talk, like I said, about some best practices for not only data collection, but how the data can be used to tell a compelling story in a multitude of very interesting and we think informative ways. To this end, I'm going to cover a little bit and give a little bit of background about our four practitioners. They have all done an exceptional job of this in their home communities. All of them are pioneers within our field, providing thought leadership, support, and are sharing this expertise with others in their everyday work. I just cannot wait for this hour to hear how they have each created true environments where entrepreneurs thrive here, which is very appropriate as the theme for this year's celebration of Global Entrepreneurship Week. So I'm going to cover a little bit of background about each of our four panelists. I'm going to start first with Maria Myers. Maria, like the organization she leads, is entrepreneurial about supporting entrepreneurs. She has tremendous experience in creating companies in the high-tech, biotech, manufacturing, and museum industries. She's lived through the struggles of launching a startup herself, turning it into a small business, and sustaining its growth. Back in 2003, Maria founded Casey SourceLink, a network connecting entrepreneurs with hundreds of business-building organizations throughout the Kansas City region. She has since scaled that network model nationally as founder of SourceLink, creating America's first and largest platform for entrepreneurship-led economic development and to support and champion e-community building. And a whole bunch of other things as well. But also I want to make sure to mention that she is executive director of the University of Missouri, Kansas City Innovation Center, where she better unites university resources within the small business community to ignite partnerships, spark innovation, and catalyze economic development that has resulted in tremendous economic impact, which I'm very excited for her to share here shortly. Next, we have Dr. Lomax Campbell. Dr. Campbell is the founding president and CEO of Third Eye Network, LLC, which is an innovative multicultural management strategy consortium serving a diverse national multi-sector clientele. He has 20 years of combined experience in small business, higher education, government administration, and that all includes strategic management, marketing, systems change, ethnic psychology, cultural competency, urban entrepreneurship, tech innovation. He's got it all. And he holds a Doctor of Management degree from the University of Maryland Global Campus, an executive MBA, and a Bachelor's of Science degree from the Rochester Institute of Technology, and a certificate in leading economic growth for the prestigious Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Next, we have joining us today Cameron Cushman. He is a Fort Worth native who has spent the last decade building entrepreneurial communities. He currently serves as the Assistant Vice President of Innovation Ecosystems at the University of North Texas Health Science Center based in Fort Worth, where he has been diligently working to connect the startup community. He began his career at the George W. Bush administration in Washington, D.C., where he served there for 6 years before he moved to our neck of the woods over in Kansas City, taking a tenure position at the Kauffman Foundation. While at Kauffman, he led several initiatives to build entrepreneurial communities. Probably my most favorite of those is 1 Million Cups, which, if you have not heard, is a wonderful weekly educational event for entrepreneurs. Now I know it spans, it's got to be well over 100, maybe even 150 cities. It's all across the country, all across the world. And so we're really lucky to have him here to share a little bit about some of the work that he's been doing. Last but certainly not least, Mr. Tom Chapman. Tom founded Chapman & Company in April of 2016. He has worked with hundreds of startups, including being a startup himself, an executive and a salesperson. His expertise in the startup world from all different kinds of angles, and is frequently successful, is what he told us. Not always, but frequently, just enough that he can really empathize with the challenges of starting an actual firm. He is regarded as one of the leading entrepreneurial ecosystem builders in the world, and for no small reason, looking at some of his research and pioneering efforts, particularly around when we're talking about creating metrics and measuring entrepreneurial ecosystems. He's often cited, referenced, and included in numerous publications all around the world. He actively speaks on this. He's active with Startup Champions Network and a bunch of other really great organizations. So that's a little bit just to tease a little bit about what is to come. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Maria first to talk a little bit about some of their lessons learned in the Kansas City market and through her tenure doing this work. All right, Maria, go ahead.
Let me steal your screen here and reshare mine. So, okay. Hello, everybody. It's great to be celebrating GEW with 170 other countries around the world. So what a great week. We're excited about that. So I'm going to talk about telling your story. And I always have to start when it comes to telling the story, the fact that nobody listens, right? So when I first started KC SourceLink, I had a wonderful marketing director. And the first thing she told me is that you got to keep repeating yourself. And I'd say, well, I keep going out there and telling people stuff and they don't seem to pick it up. And she said, well, if you repeat it for 18 months, then the first person that you told will finally hear you. So I think figuring out what your story is and understanding that you're going to repeat it for a while is a very important thing to do. So another person that also helped us with marketing and many other things just really drilled into us, how do you tell a compelling story? And I think every single meeting that we ever had together, she would start with, who's the audience and what's the objective? So it's not just in telling your story, but it's in everything you do. If you're going to have an event, who's the audience? What's the objective? If you're going to build a program, who's the audience? What's the objective? And so in telling your story, who's the audience? What's the objective? And then what's the right message and what's the right method? And we, as entrepreneurial support organizations and doing economic development, have many audiences, and each one of them is going to be approached differently. We often have the treetops, the people at the top of the community that you know and can help influence and make things happen. And then often the grassroots are where we sit trying to figure out a better way to build the ecosystem. And then we all care about our funders, and even our funders come in different audiences. So we have local, state, and federal funders, we have corporate funders, we have foundation funders, and approaching those different market segments is often very different. So when we tell our story, when we're telling our story to the treetops, we often create high-level reports with data that talks about what's happening in the entire community, and they're simple and easy to read and don't have a lot of detail associated with them. So for 5 or 6 years, we did the We Create Kansas City report. And in this report, we talked about things like, what's the state of capital? What are our resources doing? What are our entrepreneurs looking for? How aware is the community about entrepreneurship? How aware are people outside of our community about entrepreneurship? And there weren't any measures developed for those things, so we sort of made them up. And I think that that's an important part of telling your story when you're in the business that we're in, is you may not be able to find the measures that you're looking for. So you may have to think about what you have access to from a data point of view and how you can tell your story based on the data that you have. We also reach out to our entrepreneurs at a very grassroots level. And the method that we use to do that is mostly social media these days, and a lot of networking and a lot of connecting people and showing up in communities to meet the entrepreneur where they are. So it's a very different way of delivering the message. And we certainly want every entrepreneur to find the right resource at the right time. And so we're always out reaching to them. And we've also found that entrepreneurs are like third graders. There's a new crop every year. So just when you think you've told the whole world that these resources exist for them, you find out, nope, there's another crop that this hasn't been relevant to them. And so they really didn't notice. So you have to be wallpaper so that when people say, I think I'll start a side hustle, I think I'll start a business, they look up and they find you. And so sometimes that means getting your story into libraries and on social media where they can find it when they need it. Because I'm telling you, there's a new crop every year of entrepreneurs. The other thing that we have done to tell the story is to create what we call gap reports to solve issues that we see in our community. So two of these, we wanted to increase access to capital was one of them. And the other one was we wanted to determine how we could increase corporate engagement with our entrepreneurs in the community. And so in order to do these gap reports, we really had to go in and understand what was going on behind the scenes. So with our We Create Capital report, we really wanted to figure out how to get more capital here. And the message out to the community was very simple. We need more capital so that our businesses can grow. It was a very straightforward message that we needed to get out there. We just need more capital. And we built a report. And the way that we built this report was we went in and determined every single type of capital that we could have, whether it was grants, debt, or equity, and every place we could go find that funding, whether it was the SBA, the Treasury Department, local investors. And we figured out the difference between what we had and what we needed. And we took this back to the treetops and said, look, we don't have any capital in town. We don't have a single micro lender in Kansas City. We have zero equity. Our angel groups aren't funding. What are we going to do? And in this report, after we determined the data with what we had and what we didn't have, we suggested methods to change that, to change what was going on. One of the things that we found, sometimes the data that you're looking for turns out to be something completely different as to what you need. One of the things that we found in this particular report, for example, was that it wasn't that we didn't have capital and it wasn't that we didn't have good ideas. The issue was that the entrepreneurs didn't know the investors, and very importantly, the investors didn't know each other. And once we started solving the problem of getting investors to know each other, we actually saw a dramatic shift in the way that capital equity capital was happening in the Kansas City region. So stating the problem and then putting in an action plan helped with that. The next report that we worked on was We Create Corporate Engagement. Here is an example of taking data and turning it into a framework so that people have the ability to talk using the same language. So what we found was that there were actually 5 strategic exchanges that happened between our bigger corporate companies and our little smaller companies. And they consisted of things like sponsoring entrepreneurship events, people, product, and place exchanges. That's when your C-level mentors smaller companies, or perhaps they were allowing companies to be in their space and to incubate within their space, or that maybe they had a product that they could share with company. And of course, research and development and investment from corporations and small companies were important, but so was customer and vendor sourcing. So that whole how does a small business become a customer, and how do small businesses become a customer of the bigger businesses, and then how do they become vendors to the larger businesses? And each of these spaces can be looked at separately. We actually launched this report on March 10th of 2020. It did not make the headlines that week for some reason, and we continue to work toward solutions to this corporate engagement. But it gives you an example of having a framework from within which we can talk about things that need to be done. This is my favorite. I always wanted to be able to say, hey, entrepreneurship brought X number of businesses to Kansas City this year. Just like when people attract businesses, they talk about 300 new jobs are going to show up on this corner within the next time frame. I wanted that story so that we could talk that story about entrepreneurship. And so we created the We Create Jobs report. We were able to get a data set from both Kansas and Missouri that allowed us to count the number of employees from first-time employers over a year's time. And for the first time, we could go back to the community and say, hey, you know, those entrepreneurs, they created 19,000 jobs in 2021, just our first-time employers. When we were able to begin to talk using that language of 19,000 entrepreneurs, 8% of the workforce over 5 years, it was a big change in how entrepreneurship was perceived in the region. So it was a great story, and it had to do with front page news. Again, we didn't have the data we needed. We had to go find creative ways to find the information. And so I think that's a big part of this, is really looking to see what might be available for you to get the data that you need. And if you go to wecreatekc.com, you can pull down all these reports that I talked about, and you can see historically information about how data changed, or how capital changed in the Kansas City region over about a 3 or 4 year period of time. And also take a look at some of the data reports and dashboards that sit in that space to find out how we're using data to tell the story about entrepreneurship. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Rob. Stop sharing my screen.
All right, thank you, Maria. And as I mentioned before, but I'll say it again, we will hold you can ask questions in the chat, and we'll try to the presenters and folks will try to address them, but we will have some time at the end also. So jot them down, because I know I had a couple questions as Maria was sharing all that exciting information. I'm sure you did too. Dr. Campbell, would you care to go next?
Rob, how can you follow someone as a esteemed? I almost want to, come up with some sort of performance to just hold my own water. But good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to be in the room with you all. Rob, I do have a few slides that I could use to accompany these opening remarks here. I was asked, folks, to talk a little bit about the efforts that I led in Rochester, New York, when I was the director of the Mayor's Office of Community Wealth Building for the city of Rochester, New York. And then kind of as I left city government, moved into the work, continuing the work as an entrepreneur. And so here's a few slides from a presentation that I've given in different places across the country on this idea of building sustainably, focusing on resource partner network development, as opposed to solely traditional things like access to capital for entrepreneurs. When I was with government, we did a number of focus groups and interviews and small business surveys and conversations with our peers, and learned that entrepreneur support organizations are not only legally organizations, but they have many of the same problems that small businesses have. And it impeded the ability to sustainably support small business growth. And it also contributed to the challenges like siloing and lack of clear pathways to support and goal attainment, and different folks on the entrepreneur support organization side having different levels of awareness or personal experience in entrepreneurship. And so coming off of, I would say, about 9 months of research efforts, we were able to use public funding from the state of New York, and also eventually the SBA, to create a pilot program and run a second cohort of a program that I called the Resource Partner Enhancement Program. And the idea was to invest in the people who help people. As simple as that. And at the time, we had already implemented SourceLink in Rochester to kick off our ecosystem building efforts. And so the thought was, because everyone in the Resource Navigator doesn't have the same amount of social and cultural capital, because different ones offer different offerings, some of which are newer and fresher, others more legacy projects or programs and resources. We said, if we invest in the environment in which entrepreneurship is taking place, we could systematically enhance or make more culturally and contextually relevant the resources in our community. And over these two-year programs, these 24-month cohort-based peer learning programs, we learned that there were a number of challenges on the ground practicing ecosystem building. This idea that if there's not a continual source of education for resource partners, it's going to be difficult for us to speak the same language. I think Maria talked eloquently about the 4 or 5 different ways to engage corporations and how speaking the same language was essential to the work that you all were doing in Kansas City, but also funding for resource partners. What we learned is traditionally the philanthropic segment of the nonprofit sector would pit ESOs against each other because they're applying for the same pools of funding. And because of that, we're less inclined to collaborate, right? And so I think one emerging term is co-opetition, where you can cooperate or collaborate on one side, but still on some level compete on others. And then you have staff turnover, which meant the knowledge gap would persist, where you have to re-educate new staff in the ESO network on what we're doing, why we're doing it in a non-traditional way. And if there wasn't formal commitment from top leadership of ESOs, it was difficult to keep them engaged in trying to work towards centering our work around the entrepreneur or small business community and less about their individual missions and strategic priorities. So you get the gist. My favorite one to talk about, which I'll be short on, is big P and little p politics. So one person once remarked, we have to wrap our head around the ecosystem if we want to build a better ecosystem. And so if we don't address the ecosystem, this is all for naught. And so in that work and in our messaging, we talk about how network building is important. We have to spend time together, right? People trust and do business with people they get to know. And so that's no different when we start talking about collaborating across organizations. So we have standing monthly resource partner meetings. We try to create spaces where we're able to have more social interactions, whether it's virtually or in person. And we've been exploring and working on standardized agreements to really formalize our networks. We've also tried to incorporate learning, since the literature on organizational development says learning is how networks and organizations evolve and grow and become more sustainable. And so shifting the paradigm requires us to have regular capacity building workshops and centralized learning repositories, and trying to debrief when folks collaboratively do things, what went well, what didn't go well, what can we do different, and trying to capture that so that next time we do better as a collective. I think the hallmark of our work, which has made it special for me as a strategic doer, is this notion of beginning to integrate organizations' operations using different tools. So we've invested in SourceLink to try to build out the shared CRM component to do closed loop referrals and data tracking. That's still a work in progress. I think we're piloting that functionality for a few more months. We've begun discussing universal forms and interorganizational standard operating procedures. I'm trying not to geek out too much, Rob. And then in my applied research, I've started playing with something called activity-based resource clusters. It was originally service clusters, where you say an entrepreneur is focused on a specific goal in their life cycle, which is probably startup or business expansion or business retention or procurement and sales, or it could be intellectual property acquisition. And so how do you cluster resources that are specific to that goal and objective and curate pathways of support that are sustainable and repeatable, and allows that cluster of resource providers and those specific resources to apply for funding to continue to support that pathway. We looked at integrated marketing, since no organization on this call currently has a marketing budget that reflects 12 to 14% of their overall operating budget, which is the industry standard. And so because of that, leaning on one another as one another's medicine to help cure the ailment of folks saying, I still don't know what you do. I still don't know what you have going on. I still don't know where to turn to for help, even though there's a resource like a resource navigator or a shared website in place, and so making sure that being intentional about what you're messaging as a network, and then also investing together. We've been exploring the idea of creating a joint view book where every few pages is a different organization's introduction and slew of resources that can be downloaded as a PDF and cooperatively printed so that you achieve economies of scale across the network to provide those kinds of resources, or coming up with common metrics to measure performance at a cluster level, so that capital at startup versus capital at scale up versus capital at succession is measured according to the stage of life and the activity. And we're all speaking the same language and using the same measures of success. So I'll stop there, but being able to be intentional and capturing that story, and as it's been said, saying it over and over again until it sticks, because this is paradigm shift. Those are some of the keys to success in the work. Rob, I turn it back to you.
Thank you, Lomax. I think you did just as well as Maria. And Cameron, I know you're going to blow it out of the water too. But it's interesting to hear that common theme around. Maria, I think you said, like wallpaper, you got to remind all those entrepreneurs, but then Lomax, what I heard is you also have to remind the partner network too, and keep them all up to date and building those relationships. That's great. Cameron, go ahead.
Thanks, Rob. Well, happy Global Entrepreneurship Week, everybody. We are celebrating here in Fort Worth, Texas, just like I hope you guys are as well. I'm going to start by taking you back to your high school speech class. I might be in college. I took one called Argumentation and Debate. And it's essentially the art of rhetoric and the art of making an argument around something, pro and con. You remember all this. But there are three ways to think about this. There's logos, ethos, and pathos. You guys remember this? So logos is your ability to appeal to the audience's reason. And so you build up logical arguments, logos, logic, right? And this is the data piece that I like to think about, is how we make the argument that entrepreneurship is important in our cities, right? Which is really the argument we're all making. Ethos appeals to the speaker's status or authority, right? I can say it till I'm blue in the face, but I don't have any authority because I live here. But I can bring in someone like Maria Myers or Tom Chapman or several of other of you who have come to Fort Worth, Rob included, to sort of make what I say come alive and play that sort of third-party validator role that I think is so important. And then the third thing is pathos, right? So appealing to the emotions and trying to make the audience feel angry or sympathetic or something like that. So again, logos, ethos, and pathos are the three ways that you can persuade someone to do something. So I'm going to focus on logos. I'm going to focus on the first one there and really talk about what we did on our SparkYard ecosystem dashboard. And SparkYard is our version of SourceLink. And we spent many moons putting this together. It is a work in progress. It's never finished. We're always adding stuff to it. We're driving Rob crazy with all these weird requests about how can we display the data differently and track new data that we think is going to be helpful. Tom Chapman's also been hugely helpful. Maria Myers is the OG in all this, trying to get us all to kind of figure out how to do this. And so let me just kind of start. I'll show it to you in just a second, once I can figure out how to share my screen. But let me just give you a couple of considerations. One was, we asked around town if anyone was tracking this. And what we figured out was that no one else was tracking this. And so I think that's the first question you all have to ask yourself is, who's tracking it? What are they tracking? If they're tracking anything at all. So the answer I received, the only answer I received, was from our head of economic development, who sent me this kind of jankety spreadsheet that was like, I think we can track this, and I think we can track SBA loans, but I don't know how to do it. And it was like random links and things like that. But it was just a spreadsheet. It was terrible. And it didn't really help, right? It wasn't displayed in a way that could really help you enforce that logos, right? So the second thing is you got to consider, you can't just say these numbers in a vacuum. You have to compare yourself somewhere. Now, you may know that in the nation of Texas, we're a little bit different. We don't really care what happens in the rest of the country. We only care about what happens in the state of Texas. But this is not what we thought going in. So we were ranking where Fort Worth ranked population-wise. So Fort Worth is the 13th largest city in the country. And we're like, well, great, let's take 11 and 12. And then let's take 14 and 15. And let's see how we rank, right? So, hey, Nashville, how you doing? Hey, Jacksonville, Florida, how you doing? What we realized is nobody in Texas really cared. All we really cared about was the other large Texas cities and how Fort Worth ranked according to them. But really, and don't tell anyone this, all we cared about was that big city that starts with a D that's about 30 minutes east of us. We just really wanted to know how we're doing to them. So, but again, that's understanding your audience, and that's crafting the logos to try to help your local entrepreneurial ecosystem. So the next thing I'll say too is that there were several different, I'll put how you can track this data into 3 different buckets. There's the easy bucket, which is literally just counting stuff, right? So an example of this would be the Inc. 5000 companies. Inc. 5000, the Inc. magazine publishes their list of the 5,000 fastest growing companies every year. The data is a little weird, but as long as you're patient with their website, you can literally just search your city, Fort Worth, and go down and count the number of companies that made the list. Here's how many fast growing companies you have. You can do several years in advance, and then you can compare yourselves to your rival city or that next city over that you want to hold yourself up against. The second one are these sort of like federal, they tend to be federal, but these sort of publicly available databases. And these are things like SBA loans or SBIR funding that could be important for you, small business innovation research funding. You got to kind of know where to look, but all the data is there because it's federal, it's federally funded, it has to be reported, and that can really help with your storytelling as well. The third bucket, which is the hardest bucket, is the bucket where you kind of have to get into some proprietary data sources, and that can be really tricky. That can be really difficult. The example I'll use here is PitchBook, right? I work at a university. It took me a couple of years, but I talked some people into spending tens of thousands of dollars to buy a PitchBook membership, and we were able to do some really cool stuff with that data. So again, there's the easy stuff you just got to count. There's the federal system or the federal data where you got to kind of figure out where to look, but once you get it and figure it out, it's all there. And then there's the proprietary stuff, the more difficult way to do the analysis. So with that, let's see if I can get to share my screen here. Nope, that is not the right screen. Okay, wait, can you guys see the ecosystem dashboard here?
I think we might. Yes, it says the Inc. 5000.
You think you might?
Yep.
Okay,
is that the
perfect.
Inc. 5? Yep.
Okay, so I'll start here. So this is real easy, right? Oh, there go my lights. Sorry, gotta save energy here in Texas. So this is real easy, right? We compared ourselves to Austin, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Fort Worth, and we just looked at how we're doing according to the Inc. 5000 list each year. The interesting thing is Fort Worth tends to rank last, mostly because we are the smallest of the 5 cities, but some great advice we got from Tom Chapman, and you'll see this in some other places, is we needed a bookend. So we threw poor El Paso in with us. So he's like 300,000 people smaller than us, but you'll see that they rank here just so we don't always look like we're last, which I think is a really important thing. So let's go all the way to the top here. So this is our ecosystem dashboard, and then here's how we rank, right? We broke this into 3 sections: jobs, funding, and ranking. So this is just how we rank in general terms. You've got to explain it so you can see how we explain some of this stuff at the top. There might be too much text here, but we wanted to make sure that we were at least educating the audience and make sure that it was there. So this is a real easy one. This was kind of in that second bucket. We went to the Secretary of State's office and we said, hey, how many new businesses are being registered with a Fort Worth address? And all we did was just calculate these and add them all up. This is between 2016 and 2020 is the time series here. And you can see we have the bookend of El Paso. But if you take this to policymakers, this is a real thing to understand. If I'm going to start a business, which is what we're all in the business of when it comes to startups and entrepreneurs, it's a 1 or a 0. Did this person start a business, yes or no? We have that number, and you can see where Fort Worth ranks. So we're not doing so hot on this. Companies per capita. Well, maybe Austin's just way bigger population-wise. Well, they're actually not. But if you break it down per capita, it actually kind of makes a little bit more sense. And Fort Worth doesn't quite look as bad. Companies per capita. So then you tell the story by the data here, right? So this is the numbers, right? This is really boring. But if you want to show it on a graph and a chart, this is a much better way to do it. New business formations. Here we go. It's a little bit of a different way to show it. And then this gets into this third data source I was talking about, which is a proprietary database called PitchBook that tracks a lot of early stage funding. And we essentially took the 50th largest US cities, and then we added up all the data for what PitchBook said that their startups had raised. We had a very broad definition of early stage capital. So seed, friends and family, if it's even tracked, Series A, Series B, Series C of your sort of institutional rounds, right? And this is where Fort Worth ranked. So we're the 13th largest city in the country, but when it comes to early stage funding, we're actually 46th. So we like to compare ourselves to some of these other cities. Like we like to say that we're, close to Phoenix or Miami, or pick your big city, but really we're closer to Virginia Beach, Virginia, Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Wichita, Kansas. And this is that kind of stat that really stuck when we announced it. I mean, I've heard our mayor say this from the stage. I've heard several other people in town quote this stat. This is the one that kind of went viral, so to speak. A, it's kind of terrible. B, it's kind of a headline grabbing stat, like, whoa, we're not doing as well as we thought we did. And it's kind of memorable, right? You can kind of see how you get there. It doesn't require a complex economic analysis necessarily to understand it. It's just like, well, we're this by population and we're this by early stage funding. So something's out of whack here. And then how you interact on that and how you tell the story is important, but then what you do to fix that is also important as well. Here is a similar stat expressed as a graph around these cities. And we're all still kind of playing with this. Like I mentioned, it's always a work in progress. So we're still working on this. See, you can see this one still working. Then we distilled it down into an infographic. So we basically took all of this and said, all right, well, what are the really key points? And made it really simple, made it really colorful, made it really kind of fun to look at and to digest. And that's what we've done here with this little infographic, suitable for printing out, suitable for putting on a slide. It's easy to send to policymakers, et cetera. And then I already showed you the Inc. 5000 data, but here's how we compared to the rest of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And then if you break it out on the right side here, here's how we compare to the other municipalities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So you can see that Fort Worth does not have as many Inc. 5000 companies as Dallas, of course, but also Plano and Irving and Addison, which I'm guessing most of you on this call have never even heard of some of those suburbs. We're closer to them than we are to anybody else. We've also looked at cost of living index. I don't like this one as much, so I'm not going to spend any time on that, but y'all know what that means. We also did the same for jobs. In fact, on Friday, we are about to announce our third annual jobs report that tracks the number of jobs created by new firms in Tarrant County. So this is last year's report, but as of Friday during our State of Entrepreneurship event, we will be announcing the new numbers. There's a tremendous data lag on this, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But it's really interesting to track because policymakers think in terms of job creation. We've been in this weird world of low unemployment right now, but this is what they say. We all know the stat that, small business is the backbone of the American economy. Well, yeah, but so what? New businesses is really what drives new job creation. That's what we're trying to say here. If you haven't talked to the SourceLink folks about how to do this, I highly, highly, highly recommend you talk to them because it's been a transformative number for us to know about our community. And it also helps you counter the argument around economic development incentives for recruiting companies. So our number, just to give you a hint here, is about 25,000 jobs in 2020. That's when the Amazon HQ2 package was going around. Guess how many jobs Amazon was trying to bring to a city? 50,000. Well, we were doing that anyway in our county with the existing infrastructure in place in 2 years. And so why were we going to give tens of millions of dollars to Amazon when basically we're already doing it with new companies and with entrepreneurs? All right, so last section, and then I'll turn it back over to Tom here. Let's see, where is my other rankings here? Oops, hang on, give me 1 second. Ecosystem data. The last one is the funding piece, and we already kind of talked about this a little bit. But understanding how your local companies are funded, banks, credit unions, venture capitalists, all of them, we have tried to show this and try to make that logos argument that Fort Worth is behind, that Fort Worth is not ranking where we might think that it is, and that we need to do something about this, right? Kind of creating that like burning platform narrative that there's something that we need to do to get more funding, get more funds, get more SBIRs, et cetera. Let's see, which other one should I focus on here? SBIR award. So this is one that we actually used this data to win a county grant for ARPA funds to start one of the first municipally funded SBIR Phase 0 programs that has just had a tremendous year of success. It'll be a year old in January. And but you can see that Fort Worth really lagged these other US cities and or these other Texas cities. And we needed to focus on this. That Fort Worth entrepreneurs just didn't really know about this pot of funds from the federal government. They didn't really have access to it. So we wanted to try to help them figure that out. And this data was allowed us to make an argument to Tarrant County, which is the county where Fort Worth is, that we could essentially give essentially a 20x return to the county just by tapping into these federal funds. I don't know if we're going to get there or not, but it was a really compelling argument because most of these grant funds just go out to feed the homeless or do very specific things that don't ever bring a return. Those things are important. I'm not saying they're not, but it's a very different argument when you can actually say, you know, you give us this money and we'll give you a whole lot more back. So having the data in this instance really helped us be able to tell the story. So that's a little bit of what we've done in Fort Worth. I hope that is super helpful to you guys, but just remember the logos is an important piece of rhetoric and the data is the best form of logos, at least in my mind. Rob?
Thank you, Cameron. And I'm excited to hear from Tom next because he also helps on that data side and even can help you go out and get it and then transform it. And so, Tom, I think we're ready. Go ahead and take us away and round out our panel.
Can you see my screen? It says my screen is paused.
It says loading on mine. Looks like it's maybe not quite.
All right. This happens frequently when I use Google Slides. So I'm going to share and you're going to see all my non-notes. So you guys get you get to see behind the
inside
data.
scoop. All right.
So do you see something now?
Yeah, yep, that's working.
Okay, great. So I want to jump in on some of what the folks have said so far. I'm Tom Chapman. I work with a consulting company called Chapman & Company. I'm actually a full-time entrepreneur, so I run a cosmetics and beauty company called Peak Pro. But I have a hobby of really being interested in ecosystem building. For 15 years, that's all I did really was ecosystem building, specifically around data and metrics. One of the areas that places would call me is they'd say, I can't find data on how to do this. I don't know how to do this. And what I want to start with is I'm going to do some explanations. So the first thing I want to say that I thought Cameron did a great job is there should be a narrative. There should be a structure of how you're telling a story around the data that you just presented. So I'm going to walk through some data and I'm going to do it in two different ways. So I'm just going to show some slides and I want you to think about this. So this is bank funding in Wisconsin. Is it helpful to just see a map of Wisconsin with colors, not without context? So a lot of what an ecosystem builder has to do is put context around the data that's in front of them. This is that same data, but we're getting a little closer. So this is data around Milwaukee. So if we go back up here and we look at this information and we say, all right, this is Milwaukee down here. And then we drill into that data and we start to look at it. We now have data that somebody could look at and say, I see this county has $91 million in quote bank funding. What is that? And the question then becomes, what do you want to say? So you have the data, but now it's about effectuating the change that you want with the data. So if you look at Milwaukee, and what people will consistently say from Milwaukee is, we have plenty of things happening in the suburbs. Our suburbs activity with regards to startups is great. It's our urban area, our core part, that have underrepresented with regards to startups, with regards to minority communities, et cetera. So when we go in and we talk about these specific zip codes right here, in terms of bank lending, it allows us to tell a very different story. So if you look at income distribution, and there's about 15 different ways to slice this data, you can go through and say, oh, it's this area of the community that we are talking about. So why aren't there more SBA loans in those areas? So think about what that story could be told. I could just say there are fewer in the zip code than there are in suburban zip codes. And I'm leaving it to you to fill in the gaps of why. You might say it's racial prejudice, it's lack of community banks, it's fill in the blank. The challenge that you run into is, how do you craft a story so that you can tell people the context around what you want them to understand from the data that you're seeing? So first, you have to be able to find the data. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to find this data. This is SBA 7A loan data. So this is a link. It's a standing FOIA request. So that means Freedom of Information Act. You can go out here and you can just pull the same data that I pulled. So this is this slice right here, fiscal year 2010 to fiscal year 2019. You click on that, you'll download a really big Excel file. This is what that file looks like. This is actually Cedar Falls, Waterloo. I had to make it small enough that I could actually open it on a screen, but you just see it's data, right? It looks messy. So if you go through this, you can go like, I don't know what any of this stuff is. So the key when you get a slice of data is to say, I got to understand what the data is and how somebody can look at it and understand the data. So if we go back to our presentation, you say, where did this data come from? It came from the gross approval amount right here. That's data that we used. So it's basically a sum, and we use the zip code of the borrower. So 50677. In Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, it's obviously not that zip code. This is Cedar Falls, Iowa, but it was small enough. So that's where the data came from. All right. When we looked at it, we said, is it okay if we just leave it alone over here? Do we need numbers associated with that data? Or is it enough for us to go through and just say like, well, you can see that out here, there's a lot darker colors. So you can tell the suburbs are getting a lot more loans. But was that enough? No, we thought that you needed to actually put the numbers on the map. So if you're from Milwaukee, you'd be able to look at this map and be like, oh, I see how this is working. There's basically an interstate that runs right through here, and everything outside the interstate essentially gets significantly more SBA 7A loan. Now, you might say, well, that's not surprising. There's all these reasons that could be, et cetera. But if I'm going into a policymaker's office to say, we have to do a better job of creating support for underrepresented groups who want to start businesses, it's way easier for me to do that with data that says, look, these are zip codes that are high minority populations. They are getting way less from a lending perspective. So we're not talking about venture capital. We're talking about lending than these high white areas that are outside sort of in the suburbs of Milwaukee. That becomes a way more compelling argument with that data. But then when I overlay some of the other ways to look at this, it's income distribution, it's other data. All of this is federal. This is not Tom making stuff up. I'm using data to tell a story. So how do I tell that story? Two different ways. You tell it as a journalist. Who, what, where, when, why, how much. That's just like I'm giving you facts. So in zip code X, there's only 12 loans, $14 million. Is that useful to somebody that doesn't have the context? So one thing that I had to talk to Cameron about and had to talk to some of my other clients about is you are an expert. You do this every day. You have a unique set of knowledge associated with what your ecosystem is and how these pieces fit together. You're walking into an office, whether it's the mayor, city council person, county executive, CEO of a big company, and you're expecting them to understand all the stuff you've spent your life building in terms of your expertise in one graph, one sentence, etc. If you just spit data at them and think they're going to get there, they're not. They want you to not just give them the data, they want you to tell them the answer. And that answer can't just be do what I want. It has to be crafted in a way that has some journalism around it, i.e. who, what, where, when, why, how, but it also should be structured with narrative. How does that benefit an individual company? How has it benefited an individual company? Can you tell the story of a hero from the neighborhood that got a loan that was able to basically succeed in a way that that loan transformed that 6-block area. And now if we do more of that, it has a huge impact on that neighborhood. Being able to craft both the data and the journalism is not enough. You have to then coach it into some sort of narrative structure. That narrative structure should have some plot points, right? John was seeking a loan. He couldn't find enough money. He wanted to start a blank business. He went to the local community bank. It's the only community bank in the zip code. Did you know many zip codes in the same neighborhood don't have a community bank? Therefore, there's nobody there doing loans. John was able to talk to this person and establish a way that he could actually be bankable using the 7A guarantee. Do you know what the 7A guarantee is? So you're communicating with a story, but also littering in the data around that story. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the weird things we did in Fort Worth, because that was one of the things they asked me to do, talk about weird stuff in Fort Worth. So I was asked to come up with a way to measure topophilia. So this is love of place. So if you've read Ian Hathaway and Brad Feld's book, you'll know that this is a thing that Ian Hathaway talks about all over the place. So what we did was we went through and we said, well, what is love of, like, what are data sets that we can do apples to apples comparisons on, like something that might say love of place? Let me start by saying, I think it's a totally crappy, like we did a crappy job. It's not a very good measurement. So you can all criticize me. I said this to them too, by the way. So, but the starting point was really, we want to come up with a way that we can say people in Fort Worth love Fort Worth. People in Omaha love Omaha. People in Rochester love Rochester. People in Kansas City love Kansas City. How can we do that with data in a way that we know we're going to improve it over time, but like, how do we even get started? So we looked at a data source called the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages. And I'm basically going to walk through. We searched Tarrant County, Texas, and we ultimately went through and looked at location quotients. And we said, all right, what does this look like? What's even in here? Sha-na-na-na-na. And what we started to recognize was there was this weird assortment of NAICS code 71, which tend to be like touristy things, but things like restaurants. So if you think about the soul of your community, my guess is you're not thinking about the high-tech cloud security management company. My guess is you're probably thinking about a restaurant or a park or something that's unique to your community. So how would you measure that? So what we did was we pulled out NAICS code 71, and we started looking at data. So this data, quarterly establishments and employment, started to allow us to go, well, how many people are employed in these types of activities that have a tourism element, but are also locally sourced? So we started going, all right, 39 employers. There's 39 establishments, 1,500 people. How does that compare to other places? And so some of the things that end up in that bucket is you end up saying, okay, is this enough? Does this really tell us what we think it should? So to Maria's point at the beginning, it's like sometimes you just don't have the data, right? So we went through and we said, is this really topophilia? We're like, all right, it's a crappy place to start, but it's a place to start. What are the other things that we start looking at? So we started looking at parkland. We started looking at trails. We started looking at establishments that are serving food. We started looking at all these things, trying to come up with a measurement tool that we could pick up and like, all right, if we pick up Fort Worth and compare it to Austin, do we think this is a way that if you squint, you can kind of go, maybe? I think it's fair to say, I'm not sure. But we went down that path and we built a tool that allowed us to compare those 6 or 7 cities on a love of place measurement using tools that are readily available. So it isn't a perfect metric, but we think it's directionally good. Meaning we're looking at it and we're saying, does this give us a way to compare Austin to Fort Worth on an apples to apples way where we can say, if we do these things, does it actually improve the way people feel about their community? And we felt good about sort of the algorithm that we smashed together that includes data of this type. So that was my last slide. And I think I'm the last one. So I'm going to just kind of be quiet. We can take questions or do whatever Rob tells us to do. So thanks.
Thank you, Tom. First of all, my gratitude to all of our panel today for sharing this wonderful information. We have 5 minutes, and as many of you know, I'm a stickler for time, and I want to respect that. So I will open it up now if there are any questions from our attendees. If you have a question, I give you permission to come off mute and share it. Well, you guys did so good. There are no questions. I can't believe it. After hearing one another, are there things that you would like to emphasize that you thought were really critical points, or a point that you made that you just would like to reiterate as we round out our engagement together? Yeah, go ahead, Lomax.
So Rob, when I was in my MBA program, we took a marketing strategy class, and we learned that ultimately marketing attempts to do one of three things. It's to inform, it's to persuade, or it's to remind. And as I think about the work that we've done in my city over the last 5 years or so, it's been to try something different and then persuade people that different may actually be capable of solving our social and economic problems. Because what we were already doing and what we've always done has never been capable of solving the problem. And when major challenges like a pandemic happens, or civil unrest from things like the killing of a George Floyd, we learned that those social and broader phenomena tends to exacerbate the disparities that already exist. And so we have to begin to explore different ways and tell ourselves it's okay to explore different ways. So inform, persuade, remind.
I love that. And kind of it reminds me too what Tom had shared, is a place to start. It may not be perfect. And we could refine it, but at least it's a place to start. And I think a lot of that goes back to Maria, just let's count it all up. Has anyone even looked? What's here? Oh, that's great. I saw a specific question in the chat about a data source for VC funding by geography. That would probably be PitchBook, right, Cameron?
Yeah, PitchBook, it's like I mentioned, it's extremely expensive, but call your local university, call your local library. There's a chance that they may already subscribe to it. The other people who subscribe to this are venture capitalists. So if you've got some investors in your area, ask if you can go sit next to them for an hour, and they can A, show you how to use it, and B, you can pull some data down. You can search it and try it so many different ways. Crunchbase is another one that might work, and there are several other alternative ones as well. I would say PitchBook is probably the most famous, but it's also probably the most expensive. So just do with that information what you will.
I think an organization we are familiar with, Maria, didn't we partner with an organization?
Yeah, one of our civic organizations has access to it. One of our banks has access to it, and one of our venture capitalists has access to PitchBook. And so we have had some ability to do it. They're limited in what they can pull, down. The other thing is often your local press is talking about your venture capital as well. So it's more art than science on that, but just looking at the Business Journal or some of these other groups that are reporting, you may find more information there than frankly you'll find even on PitchBook, because the story is told, but sometimes those Form Ds are not filed.
So my experience with the data set, and I've gone through and I've audited it for 4 states, is no matter what you take, it's incomplete. So like PitchBook gets probably in the Midwest somewhere between 60 and 65%, which is the highest percentage. Crunchbase will get like 30 to 40%, but you'll see big errors in Crunchbase. So like the biggest startup in the last 20 years in Nebraska is called Huddle. Huddle in Crunchbase is located in Des Moines, Iowa. So I mean, there's like big problems. The challenge that you run into with the data set is if you're doing a good job of aggregating from Form Ds, Crunchbase, other free data sets, you're probably going to get as much as you would for PitchBook, but you're not going to have it to then compare to a community down the road where you don't have the same type of access to just the deal information that's coming across your desk. So I would look for people that are aggregating the data if you can't afford one of the databases, because you're going to be able to get sort of comparative data. But if you just want to know what's going on, keep your own database. It'll probably end up being better than what most people do.
All right. 1 o'clock, folks, here, Central anyway. So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. I want to first send a very sincere thank you to Maria, Tom, Cameron, Lomax. Thank you so much for your willingness to share your time, your experiences, some best practices, leading thoughts on how to do this work more impactfully and better communicate it to stakeholders and to entrepreneurs. I want to thank everyone who is attending today for participating in this conversation. And last but not least, we also want to acknowledge again Global Entrepreneurship Week. Encourage you to get involved both locally at your own events, as well as the other national events that are available through the Global Entrepreneurship Week website and the calendar there. Thank you for all of the work that each of you do every day for entrepreneurs and small business owners. It's incredibly important. And if you're wanting to follow up with any of today's presenters, drop us a note. We'll get you connected. Thank you all. Have a great rest of this week. Hopefully you'll be able to survive this week for some of you. I know you're producing Global Entrepreneurship Week events. And have a wonderful afternoon.